On the evening of May 11th, 2006, a 29-year-old hairdresser named Nisha Patel Nasri sat down for a rare break in between clients inside of her hair salon in the Wembley district of London. Nisha had opened up the salon when she was just 18 years old, and she'd been running it herself for the last 11 years. And in that time, she'd attracted around 2,000 regular customers, which was already very impressive. But it was particularly impressive because this was not like a big salon on a bustling city street. Instead, it was a tiny shop on a quiet residential road way out in the northwest suburbs of London. She actually ran the salon out of a single room in her brother's house, but through hard work and sheer talent, she had grown it into a thriving business. Now, generally speaking, Nisha was glad to be busy, because if she was busy, it meant she was making money. But sometimes, like right this second, stopping and kind of kicking back and relaxing for a second when she could felt very welcome. And so she plopped down into a salon chair, she grabbed the morning paper, and she started reading it. The front page story was about how the government had just released its report on the previous year's July 7th bombings, which were a series of terrorist attacks that had taken place on London's trains and buses during the morning rush hour. Now, it had been almost 10 months since these horrific attacks, but Londoners still did not feel safe. I mean, because of this attack, there was this growing fear of really all types of violent crime that could be visited upon them. It just felt like this shattered their worldview. And Nisha, more than most people, could really understand why people felt that way. In fact, she personally had experienced an attempted home invasion recently. Just 5 days ago, when Nisha had been at her house, located about a block away from the salon, she had been making dinner when she had begun to hear the front mail slot rattling. So on her front door, there was a slot that could open up from the outside where the mail person could slide mail into her house. Now, when Nisha heard this, she didn't immediately, panic. I mean, it's pretty normal for mail to be dropped off through her door. But, she was curious, so she walked to the front of the house and she looked out the window to see who it was. Was it the mail person? Was it a neighbor? Was it a friend? But when she looked out, it was none of those people. It were these three men wearing dark clothes who she didn't know who they were, and they were clearly trying to break into her house. But these men had picked the wrong house to rob, because in addition to being a hairdresser, Nisha was also a special constable, which was basically a part-time volunteer police officer. So instead of her, hiding or calling for help, she'd just gone out to confront the men herself. And they'd been so caught off guard by how confidently she strode out there and called them off that they'd literally just turned and ran away. Now, even though Nisha had really handled this quite well and basically scared these guys away, it left her feeling really unsettled. And so that, combined with the lasting trauma that Londoners felt because of the bombings of the year before, Nisha these days was feeling very much on edge. However, every time Nisha found herself sort of defaulting to that victim mindset, being fearful that something else terrible is going to happen to her, she would remind herself that, she was a special constable, and whatever problems were thrown her way, she would handle them, like she always did. But even though for Nisha that was sort of a confidence booster, for other people in Nisha's family, they weren't so thrilled she was a special constable. In particular, her older brother, Caton, the one who actually owned the house where Nisha ran her salon, he had pleaded with her not to join the special constable program because he felt like the work was way too dangerous. There were constantly stories in the papers about attacks on police. And unlike full-time officers, special constables were not authorized to use weapons to defend themselves. But for Nisha, that had never been an issue. She felt very proud of what she was doing, especially now that everybody was so on edge after the July 7th bombings. Now was the time for people to continue to step up and keep London safe, and so she felt like that's what she was doing. And so as Nisha finished reading the front page of the paper, she heard a bell jingle on the front door of the salon. So she tucked the newspaper away, hopped up, and went to go greet her next client. Later that night, around 10 p.m., Nisha closed up shop and swept the salon floor. And then a few minutes later, she heard the front door jingle again, and she looked up and saw her husband, whose name was Fadi Nasri, walking in with a paper bag of takeout food. Nisha instinctively shouted up the stairs for her brother, Caton, who had come home from work earlier that evening and had been hanging out in his part of the house since then. And a moment later, he came down the stairs to join the couple for some food. Fadi spread out the plastic containers of Indian food on the coffee table in the waiting area, and Caton began eating, while Fadi went ahead and sat down in Nisha's salon chair to get his haircut. And Nisha was even more careful than usual with his haircut. because she and her husband were going to their brother's wedding in a couple of days, and Nisha and Fadi knew they'd be in all the wedding pictures, and so they wanted to look their best. While she cut Fadi's hair, she helped her brother talk through preparations for the wedding. Their mother and father had both passed away years ago, so when it came to big family events like this, the two siblings were kind of on their own. Caton reminisced about how he'd given Nisha away at her own wedding, which was exactly 3 years ago yesterday, since their own father couldn't. Nisha smiled as she continued cutting Fadi's hair. Thinking about their wedding anniversary reminded her how grateful she was for her husband and the life they'd built together since. A few months after they had gotten married, Nisha had loaned Fadi some money to open up a limousine rental company, and his business had really taken off. And Nisha was proud to see her husband working these long hours and making great money. It felt like they really were a team, two ambitious, successful business owners working together to build a better future. Once Fadi's haircut was done, Nisha called Caton over and she gave him a pre-wedding trim as well. And as she finished up, Caton asked her if maybe she wanted to spend the night here at his house. He was still rattled by that attempted break-in at Nisha's house a couple of days earlier, and he really didn't feel like she was safe in her own home. But Nisha said, no, we're fine. So around 11 p.m., Nisha and her husband Fadi walked back to their house, which was, again, right around the corner. Their house was a cream-colored, two-story home with red shingles on the roof. And along with Fadi's car in the driveway, there was a stretch limo and a Humvee parked on the curb that Fadi used for work, and which both very much stood out in their middle-class neighborhood. Nisha unlocked the door and then tossed her phone and keys on the sofa and then went upstairs to get ready for bed. But while she was in the bathroom washing her face, Fadi popped his head in and told her he was heading out to go meet with his friend to go play snooker, which is a way of saying pool, but in the UK. Now, Nisha was not offended that he wanted to go out and see his friend, like that was fine. But in reality, she and her husband had been talking about wanting to start a family. And for the most part, they both agreed that now was the time to, try to have kids. And so when she was thinking about tonight, she was thinking, maybe we could, try to have a baby tonight. But it just seemed like not only tonight, but just generally speaking, every time there was like a window to, try to have a kid, Fadi was either too tired or he was going out with friends, or it just seemed like he would say he was interested, but then when it was time to actually do the thing, he was nowhere to be found. And so it seemed like that was happening again tonight. But it was late and Nisha didn't feel like arguing with her husband. So she dried her face and just told Fadi to have fun with his friend. A few minutes later, as Nisha brushed her teeth, she heard the sound of her husband's car pulling out of the driveway. A little bit later, she went downstairs and turned off the lights and locked the doors, and then went back upstairs and crawled into bed alone. But then, about 30 minutes later, right as Nisha is about to fall asleep, she hears these footsteps in her house, and she didn't hear the sound of her husband return home. She just hears these footsteps downstairs. And so she sits up and she's hearing these sounds, and she thinks to herself, it could be my husband. Or, because just less than a week ago, somebody tried to break into her house, she's thinking, are they back? Has someone broken into my house? And so not sure who was down there, she got out of bed quietly, grabbed a flashlight, tiptoed out of her room, and then began heading downstairs to see who was in her house. A few minutes later, one of Nisha's neighbors was woken up by blood-curdling screams in the street outside his house. He jumped out of bed, went to the window, pulled back the curtain, and when he looked out, he saw Nisha limping down the street in her nightgown with a flashlight in her hand. And so the neighbor instinctively called for an ambulance and then rushed outside to help Nisha. And when he caught up with Nisha, she was hobbling back up her own driveway, and he asked her if she was okay, and she just choked out that she'd been stabbed. But before she could say who stabbed her, she collapsed onto the pavement, clutching this bloody spot on her thigh. At this exact moment, the neighbor looked up from Nisha, and he saw a man in a hooded sweatshirt running away down the street. By this point also, more people were trickling out onto the road, and another woman ran over to Nisha and put a towel on her leg and began pressing on the wound. And then as soon as the first neighbor who had gone outside and seen Nisha, as soon as he heard the ambulance coming down the road, he stood up and he bolted down the road to go find Nisha's brother and tell him what had happened and what he had seen. Just moments later, a few minutes before midnight, Detective Chief Inspector Nick Scola felt his pager buzz. He was an experienced detective working out of the Wembley station, and that night he was the senior investigator on call in case any major crimes happened. He'd been hoping he could get through the shift without any emergencies, but when he called the station to see what that pager buzz was about, he could tell, there was clearly an emergency because the dispatcher told him to go to 17 Sudbury Avenue as quickly as possible. And so Scola hopped in his car, and a few minutes later, he pulled up to a very chaotic scene on a residential street. In the driveway of a cream-colored house with red shingles, paramedics were loading this young woman into an ambulance, and police officers were already cordoning off the area with tape to keep a crowd of very rowdy and restless neighbors away. As Scola walked closer to this house, he saw there was a trail of blood on the driveway. He flashed his badge to the other officers standing guard around the house, and they all lifted the crime scene tape to let him come inside. One of the officers told Scola there had been a stabbing, and the victim, the young woman, was in critical condition. And while the officers were debriefing him on what they knew so far, Scola noticed a car pull up out on the street, and a man got out of the car and began running towards the house, and as he did, he was clearly crying and screaming and just basically hysterical. As he got close enough, Scola heard this man frantically tell the paramedics that he was the victim's husband. And so Scola saw this happening and just made a mental note to make sure he interviewed that guy as soon as he had any idea what he was dealing with. Scola looked around and he noticed right away that there was a stretch limousine and also a black Humvee parked in front of this house, which, obviously those are expensive. And so, maybe those attracted burglars to the house and, maybe she was there when burglars went inside. So wrong place, wrong time. But when Scola walked up the driveway past the forensics team who was already taking photos and collecting evidence, he noticed that the front door and the windows near the front door had no signs of forced entry. There was no damage done. And then also when Scola went around to the back of the house, the back door, the other entrance into the house, also did not show any sign of forced entry. And then when Scola went into the house, he noticed that in the living room, there was nothing broken or anything out of place, and in fact, he even saw a wallet and a stack of cash sitting out in the open, totally untouched. And so even though his initial theory was robbery, it was starting to look less and less likely. Scola left the living room and went into the kitchen, and there he noticed there was a butcher block that was clearly missing one of its knives. And this butcher block was at the very back of the counter behind a bunch of other items, including a row of champagne glasses that did not look like they had been disturbed. So he figured that, this knife could not have been taken during a struggle, like somebody, fighting with the victim, they grab the knife and then they stab her. The knife had to have been taken when there was relative peace in the house. Otherwise, those champagne glasses and the other stuff near the butcher's block would have been toppled over, and they weren't. And so Scola began to kind of piece together a working theory of what could have happened here. And what he came up with was the victim, the young woman, must have heard a noise that spooked her. And so she wound up going into her kitchen and she carefully got her knife to protect herself and then maybe stepped outside to investigate this noise. And as soon as she got out there, her attacker or whoever was out there making the noises, maybe they were trying to break in or something, they must have seen her, they get into some sort of altercation, the knife gets pulled out of her hand, and then she is stabbed with her own knife. Now, of course, this was really specific, and Scola had no idea if this was true or not, but it would sort of explain away all the anomalies he was seeing so far. A few minutes later, Scola went outside to speak to some of the neighbors who had gathered in the street. And one neighbor told Scola that he had actually seen a man in a hooded sweatshirt running away from the scene. But this neighbor said he had not seen the man's face, so he didn't know who it was. And so at this point, Scola figured the next thing he would need to do is just speak to the victim once she was stable, because she would obviously be able to give a better description of what happened and who her attacker actually was. But unfortunately, less than an hour later, while Scola was still at the crime scene, just kind of taking it all in and asking basic questions and gathering some evidence, he got a call from the hospital. His stabbing victim, Nisha Patel Nasri, had actually bled to death on the way to the hospital, which meant this was officially a murder investigation. The next morning, after Detective Scola was finally done processing the scene, he walked into the Wembley police station, and it was unusually quiet. The other officers looked very somber. A little bit confused, Scola asked one of his colleagues what was going on here, and she would tell him that the victim, Nisha from last night's murder, was one of their own. She was a special constable, and plenty of officers in the Wembley station had worked with her. And so Scola now understood, what a gut punch this really was. But also, this information was pretty interesting to Scola, because at first, he thought Nisha was killed in like a random robbery gone wrong. But now, Scola wondered if this murder was not random at all. Maybe Nisha was being targeted because she was a police officer. Maybe there was a criminal who she had put behind bars or prosecuted in some way that was out to get her. And when Scola began doing some digging on Nisha and some of her police work, he learned that Nisha had actually had somebody try to break into her house a few days earlier. There were these 3 men that she had basically scared off when they had tried to break into her house. And so now Scola's thinking, that can't be a coincidence. And so right away, a team of officers got to work trying to figure out the identities of those 3 men who had attempted to break into Nisha's house the first time. And so while the officers did that, Scola headed back to the crime scene to go see if he could find that knife that was missing from the kitchen. He figured at this point that had to be the murder weapon. And if it was, the killer's fingerprints or DNA could be on the knife. When Scola pulled up on Sudbury Avenue a little bit later, he saw swarms of reporters and TV cameras crowding around the house, where the crime scene tape was still up, keeping them back. And as Scola approached the house, a reporter noticed him and ran towards him with a microphone and began asking him questions. Namely, did the police have any idea why a special constable had been murdered at her own home? But Scola brushed the reporter off. He was not about to talk about this case yet. He really did not have any information to give up anyways. And he ducked under the police tape. Once inside the cordoned-off area, Scola saw there were dozens of officers already scouring the area looking for this missing knife, dumping out trash cans and digging through the bushes. Scola caught one of the investigators' eyes and she kind of shrugged, which Scola took to mean that they hadn't found it yet. Scola also watched as 2 other officers hauled this high-powered vacuum out of a truck and over to a storm drain on the curb. And then they turned on this vacuum and began sucking up everything out of the drain, presumably to look for this knife. Scola walked over to them right as they began sifting through what they had sucked up. The vacuum had pulled up a whole bunch of stuff between leaves and trash and food wrappers, but ultimately there was no knife. Scola figured the killer must have dumped this knife somewhere near the crime scene, because they couldn't have gotten far before they realized they needed to get rid of it. And so Scola felt confident that this knife was going to turn up eventually. They just had to keep on looking. In the meantime, Scola went back inside the house, where he found a pair of investigators sitting in the living room with Nisha's husband, Fadi. And Fadi had his phone out, and he was playing a recording of this woman shouting violent threats. One of the officers who saw Scola pulled him aside and caught him up to speed. They said that Fadi had a solid alibi for the time of Nisha's murder. He was with a friend playing snooker a few miles away, and that friend had already confirmed it. And the officer also told Scola that Fadi had come forward and said that he already had a pretty good idea of who might have killed his wife. And so Scola sat down on the couch next to Fadi, and Fadi at that point started his story from the beginning. He said that 2 months ago, he'd gotten into a feud with a rival limo business owner in Scotland. He said that he had sold a Humvee to this other company under the condition that after the sale, Fadi could borrow it back for one last job. But the other company's owner had gone back on the deal and refused to let him borrow the car after the transaction. So in a moment of what he was calling poor judgment, Fadi had traveled to Scotland, rented the Humvee under a fake name, and driven it all the way back to London. But then Fadi said, while he was driving back to London, clearly the other owner figured out what Fadi was up to, because they gave Fadi a call, and Fadi recorded the voicemail they left. And so Fadi played the recording of this other business owner for Scola. And Scola, he heard this woman screaming over and over again that she was going to kill Fadi and his wife if he didn't bring her Humvee back. And as Scola listened, he thought this woman did not sound like she was joking. This seemed like a real threat. Now, Fadi said he did return the Humvee. He gave it back to the business owner, and so she no longer had a reason to kill him and his wife. Still, though, Fadi felt strongly that, this woman really had it out for them, and so he wanted the police to look into her. And for Scola, they really didn't have that many leads to think of, and so he figured he would check it out first. So he took Fadi's phone to download that audio recording and also all the call logs, and then he promised he would send a team to Scotland to look into this right away. One afternoon, about a month later, Detective Scola sat in his office alone, going over the case files again and again. He was stressed because the media had been covering Nisha's murder since day one, and there was a lot of public pressure to solve this case. But the police had been investigating it really aggressively for a month, but realistically had almost nothing to show for it. Ever since Scola's last conversation with Fadi, the investigation had been moving very slowly. Some detectives had gone to Scotland to look into this rival business owner angle who had, supposedly threatened Fadi and his wife, but they hadn't found anything notable. So that lead was looking like a bust. Also, the homicide team had not been able to identify those 3 men who had attempted to break into Nisha's house 5 days before she was killed. Scola and his team had interviewed Nisha's family, her friends, her neighbors, but so far they had not been able to identify any likely suspects, again outside of that business owner in Scotland. It just didn't seem like there was anyone who would have wanted to hurt Nisha. She was liked and respected by basically everyone they spoke to. However, there had been one pretty significant development in the case over the past month, and it was that police had finally found a knife that looked similar to the one missing from Nisha's kitchen. It was found in a storm drain about a block away from her house. However, Scola was still waiting for the crime lab to actually determine whether it was the murder weapon or not. But just then, Scola got a phone call, and it was someone from the crime lab. And they told him that after analyzing this knife, they had found traces of Nisha's blood on the blade. So this definitely was the murder weapon. For the first time in weeks, Scola felt really optimistic. He finally had a real piece of hard evidence, a fresh clue here to really lead this investigation. And now he needed all hands on deck. So he hung up the phone and then gathered his team for a meeting. And then once they were all together, he told the other detectives that they had found the murder weapon. But they had to keep their discovery a secret. If the killer found out police had this knife, they might panic and flee. And so to avoid jeopardizing the investigation, Scola wanted to keep the discovery out of the press. After everybody was aligned on that, the next step in the investigation was that Scola was going to send officers out to collect video from all the security cameras near where the knife had been found. London is one of the most heavily surveilled cities in the entire world, with hundreds of thousands of CCTV cameras everywhere. So Scola figured one of those cameras must have captured the person who dropped that knife into the drain. The homicide squad would spend the rest of the week combing through countless hours of CCTV footage from the area, hoping to find the moment when the knife got dropped in the storm drain. But it was like trying to find a needle in a haystack. However, after about a week of this, another detective eagerly called Scola over to his computer. He said he had finally found something that could be useful. And so Scola walked over, and the detective said that the footage he was looking at, which was paused at the moment, was of a CCTV camera taken from a shop that was on the same road as the storm drain. And so Scola bent down and stared at the screen as the detective hit play on the video. Now, the storm drain itself was just barely out of frame, but the camera clearly captured the glow of headlights as a car pulled up near the storm drain. The car stopped there for about 7 seconds. And even though you cannot see anybody getting out and disposing of a knife into the drain, the car was stopped long enough that somebody could have done that before the car took off again. But critically, when this car took off again, it passed through this camera's frame very clearly. And as the car drove past the storefront, the detective paused the camera. As soon as he did, Scola leaned in closer to get a better look at this car. Now, the video was dark and grainy, so right away it was impossible to read the license plate on the car. But despite the graininess, there definitely were a few identifying details Scola could make out. The car was clearly a gray Audi, and there was an antenna in the center of the roof, and also one of the lights above the license plate was not working. Now, Scola knew there were literally tens of thousands of Audis in London. And so they knew the only way they'd track this one down is by sending officers out into the street to literally look for it. But really what they're looking for is Audis that have that antenna on the roof and a light that doesn't work in front. Now, of course, this was going to be extremely time-consuming, but Scola felt like they didn't have a better lead here. And so they began this process. And for the next few weeks, that's all they were doing, just out on the streets canvassing for this Audi. And they didn't find it. And so as this investigation was feeling like it was about to hit another dead end, Scola felt like he just couldn't let that happen. There was too much pressure on him to get this done. But then suddenly, he thought about something that he'd totally put out of his mind. Fadi's phone. They'd actually taken the phone from Fadi 2 months ago to download that voicemail and also download the call log, but they actually hadn't given it back to Fadi yet. They were just holding the phone in evidence right now. Now, Scola felt like that audio message on the phone really had not amounted to anything and likely wouldn't. But Scola figured, why don't we look in that phone to see what else is on there? Maybe there were fresh clues about who might have wanted to hurt Nisha. So he assigned one of his forensic techs to download everything from Fadi's phone onto a drive. And then once they had done that, Scola took this drive and he plugged it into his computer and began sorting through all this data. He saw a photo that caught his eye. The photo was of a woman's thigh, and she was clearly lying in a bed in what looked like a hotel room. And even with the bright flash and poor camera quality, Scola could tell that the woman's skin was pale white, and so it was definitely not Nisha's leg. After finding this photo on Fadi's phone, Scola immediately drove to Nisha and Fadi's house. And when Fadi opened the door, Scola stepped inside and showed him the photo and asked him point blank if he was having an affair. Fadi right away said no, and he insisted he would never do that to Nisha, and the woman in the picture was literally just a friend. Now, Scola immediately felt like Fadi was lying. He did not believe him for a second. But there was no way to, force Fadi to tell the truth. And so ultimately, all Scola could do was just leave, get back in his car, go back to the station. And on the drive there, he wondered to himself if he had sort of just blown that opportunity. Should he have waited for more solid evidence before confronting Fadi? But he was also thinking that, there's so much pressure on him to solve this case, that he just had to make moves like this, take some chances. And so it is what it is. When Scola got to the precinct, he parked his car and he went in his office to think. And almost as soon as he sat down, there was a knock at the door. It was a man named Sid Shenoy, who was the family liaison officer who'd been working with Nisha's family. His job was to support the grieving family and communicate with them throughout the investigation. And so as a result of this role he was playing, Sid had created a level of trust with the family that really none of the other detectives had with the family. And Shenoy, when he walked in the room, told Scola that he'd just gotten a really interesting call from Fadi. He said Fadi had confessed to something that he'd basically been too afraid to tell Scola in person when he had just been visiting him, a couple minutes ago. And so Shenoy told Scola that you really ought to call Fadi and let him tell you what he just told me. And so right away, that's what Scola did. He called Fadi. And Fadi, when he picked up, he sounded very nervous and anxious and ashamed as he broke down and admitted that actually, yes, he was having an affair. He had lied. He said the leg in the photo belonged to a woman named Laura Mocking, and she was a Lithuanian sex worker who he'd been seeing for 3 months before his wife's death. Fadi said the reason he had lied to Scola is because he didn't want Nisha's family to find out he'd been cheating on her. But Scola knew there was also another obvious reason to lie here, because an affair would clearly give Fadi a motive to kill his wife. Fadi had been crossed off the suspect list at this point just based on his alibi. But this affair now made him look very suspicious. However, Scola just felt like it just didn't make sense that Fadi would be the killer. Number one, he did have a strong alibi. And also, two, apart from hiding this affair, which you could justify, you could say that obviously he didn't want ripple effect damage on the family or something, he'd been very cooperative with the investigation. I mean, he'd given them his phone, which had this damning photo on it. I mean, he'd sort of been very forthright. And so a new theory began to take hold in Scola's mind. If Fadi wasn't the killer, maybe it was possible that his mistress, Laura, was, or at least was directly involved in some way. I mean, she would have all the reason in the world to want to get rid of Nisha. So on September 1st, almost 4 months after Nisha was murdered, her husband's mistress, Laura Mocking, was brought into the station on suspicion of murder. In the interrogation room, detectives confronted her with all the evidence they had gathered that showed her relationship with Fadi was not just a casual affair. The two of them had met at a brothel where Laura was working as a sex worker, but eventually she stopped charging him to see her, which likely meant she must have developed real feelings for him. And so the detectives suggested that, if Nisha was gone for good, Laura would have Fadi all to herself. Laura insisted she did not know anything about the murder, and then she gave them a solid alibi. But that didn't mean much, because eyewitnesses thought they saw a man in a hooded sweatshirt running away after Nisha was stabbed. So the working theory was if Laura was involved in this murder, it was pretty likely that she had hired somebody else to do the dirty work. However, the detectives did not have real evidence. And so, despite their suspicions, they had to release her. And then once again, they were back at square one. However, not long after Laura was allowed to go home, Scola was walking through the precinct when the family liaison officer, Sid Shenoy, came running up behind him. Shenoy told him that he just had a very interesting conversation with Nisha's brother, Caton. Caton had told him that after finding out about Fadi's affair, he had been furious. The whole family was so upset about it. And Caton said that now that he really had this horrible opinion of Fadi, he felt comfortable sharing something about Fadi that he had been keeping to himself. Caton told Shenoy that he thought Fadi might not be the professional businessman he pretended to be. Instead, Caton said that Fadi might actually be involved with something criminal. According to Caton, Fadi had said there were a lot of sketchy people in his contacts, and he was worried about what the police might find on his phone. But Caton said that Fadi had not been specific about what he meant when he said sketchy people. He didn't know what he was saying or why he was involved with them. And so after hearing this, Scola told his team to go through Fadi's phone records and run the name of every person who appeared in his call log. And apart from all the calls back and forth to Laura, the mistress, there was one other name that jumped out, a convicted drug dealer named Roger Leslie. And when Scola saw this, he realized that he might have been approaching this investigation all wrong. He'd really struggled to find suspects because there was no one who would have wanted to hurt Nisha who didn't have an alibi. But now he realized that maybe that was the case because Nisha was not actually the killer's target. Maybe the target was Fadi. If Fadi was involved in the drug trade, then anyone could have come after him for any number of reasons. It could have been a drug deal gone wrong, or retribution for a debt he didn't pay, or even maybe a hit by a rival gang. He didn't know, but there was way more possibilities here. And the more Scola dug into Fadi, the more suspicious evidence he found. He learned that before Fadi and Nisha got married, Fadi had run an escort agency. He closed it down and started a more legitimate business 3 years ago, but Scola knew there could be any number of former employees or customers wives who might still have a problem with Fadi. And then there was that threatening voicemail from the rival limo company. That whole story made it seem entirely possible that Fadi could easily get wrapped up in very serious business disputes, which meant there could be more disgruntled rivals out there. Basically, it seemed entirely possible that there were loads of people out there who might have had it out for Fadi, not Nisha. And so that became the new direction of this investigation. And so the first person Scola looked into with this new direction was Roger Leslie, the drug dealer who had made a few calls to Fadi. However, there was one issue that kept Roger from becoming a primary suspect. He didn't own a gray Audi. So if he was involved in the murder, he probably didn't work alone. And so the police set up a trace on Roger Leslie's phone, hoping that his call logs would lead them to an associate who did own a gray Audi. And eventually, they sure did. And that person who owned the gray Audi was the missing piece that made the whole puzzle come together. Based on those call logs and all the other evidence found during this investigation, the following is what police believe happened to Nisha Patel Nasri on May 11th, 2006. Around 11:50 p.m., just as Nisha was falling asleep, the killer pulled up to her house in the passenger seat of a gray Audi. The driver waited in the car while the killer got out and crept around to the back of the house. And as he walked to the back of the house, he kept looking in the windows to confirm all the lights were out. And they were. And then when he got to the back door, he pulled out a key he'd managed to get his hands on to open it up. And then once the door was open, he stepped inside. The killer slowly moved through the kitchen and then stopped because he heard the floorboards upstairs creaking. And so he held his breath as he realized that somebody upstairs was making their way downstairs. They were caught. The killer didn't know what to do. They hadn't prepared for this at all. He thought everybody in the house would be asleep. So he panicked and he reached over and pulled a knife out of that butcher's block in the kitchen and then ducked behind a wall to hide. He heard the footsteps getting closer and closer and he's trying his best to hide. and then he saw a beam of a flashlight make its way into the kitchen, and then it comes across and lands squarely right on them. And the person holding that flashlight was Fadi's wife, Nisha. When Nisha saw the killer, she screamed and ran for the front door. But the killer knew he could not let her get away because now she'd gotten a clear look at his face and he was caught. So he chased her outside, out into the driveway, clutching that kitchen knife in his hand, and about halfway down the driveway, he tackled her and then sunk the knife deep into her thigh. Nisha actually managed to fight him off despite this gaping wound in her leg, and she scrambled up and began running down the street screaming for help. And at this point, the killer saw lights coming on in the neighbors' houses, and his heart was pounding, and he knew that Nisha was no longer his biggest problem. He had to get out of here immediately before anybody on the block saw his face too. So he just sprinted back to the Audi, where the driver was still waiting for him, and he told the driver to go, just take off, drive out of here. And so the driver, they did just that, but they were panicked and confused, and as they're going around the corner, they're asking the killer, like, what just happened? I mean, as far as the driver knew, they were only here to pick up some ecstasy for a drug deal. They did not expect anybody to get stabbed. But the killer just snapped at the driver to stop talking about it because he hadn't expected the night to go this way either. It was a total mess. And so at this point, the killer looked down at the bloody knife that was still in his hand, and he realized he had to get rid of it. And so he told the driver to just pull over. And so the driver did. They pulled over to the curb on this commercial street just a block away from Nisha's house, and the killer quickly opened up the door and threw the knife into a nearby storm drain. Then he slammed the door shut again, and as the Audi careened down the road, the killer took the driver's cell phone out of the cup holder and called the man who'd hired him to tell him everything that had just gone horribly wrong. The person he called was the drug dealer, Roger Leslie. However, when Roger got off that phone call with the killer, Roger immediately called the person who'd hired him. Roger had actually been hired to pull off a hit, but he didn't want to get his own hands dirty, so he'd outsourced the job. But now, after having spoken to the killer about this botched hit where basically they stabbed her and they had no idea if she actually was going to die or not, in fact, the last thing they saw was her running down the road screaming for help, now Roger knew he would have to explain himself to the actual mastermind of the murder plot, the person who'd given him the key to get inside. And that person was indeed Fadi Nasri, Nisha's husband. It turned out that Fadi was involved with a bunch of criminals, but they weren't after him. They were his friends. Because even though Fadi pretended to be this successful, legitimate businessman, he really was not. He was deep in debt, and he'd paid Roger Leslie to kill Nisha for the life insurance money. That way he could pay his debts and then also run off with his new mistress, Laura. And so while Nisha had been wanting to start a family and was starting to sense that maybe Fadi was not fully committed to that idea, well, her instincts were good because it turned out Fadi did not want to start a family with her. He wanted to kill her and move on. According to prosecutors, that earlier break-in at Nisha and Fadi's house a few days before she was killed was very likely either a reconnaissance mission or a failed first attempt to kill Nisha. In the end, 4 people were arrested and charged with Nisha's murder. They were Fadi Nasri, Roger Leslie, the hitman who actually stabbed Nisha, his name was Jason Jones, and the driver of the car, a man named Tony Emanuel. Now, the driver was acquitted, but the other 3 men were all convicted and sentenced to life in prison. On Monday, June 4th, 2012, 34-year-old Eric Samoa stood between 2 brand-new Jaguar cars on the showroom floor of a luxury car dealership in Bethesda, Maryland. Eric was talking to a potential new car buyer. Eric was this dealership's top salesperson, sometimes pulling in between $10,000 and $20,000 US in commission checks every month. Eric was very handsome. He wore a well-fitted black suit and a red tie, and he was tall with a shaved head, brown eyes, and a goatee. Eric smiled at his potential customer, told him a joke, and then put his hand on the guy's shoulder like they were old friends. But pretty quickly, Eric sensed this guy was not actually ready to buy a car just yet. Still though, Eric had not become the top salesperson at this dealership by giving up at the first sign that the customer is not fully committed. Instead, Eric just continued talking and listening to the guy, doing his best to establish a real connection. That way, when this guy came back and was ready to buy a car, he would hopefully come back to Eric. The potential customer walked around one of the Jaguars and told Eric he would definitely think about buying it. He said he loved how it looked, he just needed to talk to his wife first. Eric said he totally understood, and then he handed the guy his business card and walked him out of the showroom and said he looked forward to meeting with him again. Then Eric turned and walked back across the showroom floor, past all the polished, perfectly lit cars, into a bright carpeted hallway that led to the break room and a few offices. Eric walked into his manager's office and said he was taking off for the day. His manager told him to have a good night, and Eric just grinned, because he definitely had a good night planned, and he couldn't wait to get it started. About 15 minutes later, Eric pulled into the parking lot of his high-rise luxury apartment building in Silver City, Maryland, a suburb of Washington, D.C. The apartment building was the type of place that catered to young professionals, with a rooftop pool and plenty of bars and restaurants within walking distance. Eric walked into the lobby and took the elevator up to the 6th floor, where his place was. Once inside his apartment, he went right to the kitchen and poured himself a drink. Then he headed to his bedroom and changed into black jeans and a black t-shirt, and then he walked out onto a small balcony. He left the door open behind him. Out on his balcony, Eric sipped his drink as he watched the local restaurants and bars down below come to life. Eric loved this part of town, and he loved his apartment, especially because he'd had to work so hard to be able to afford it. Eric was the youngest of 4 children born to immigrant parents from Ghana. And when Eric and his siblings were kids, their parents had told them that the United States was filled with opportunity, and that in the United States, they could be anything they wanted as long as they worked really hard. So Eric had grown up basically believing the American dream was true, that if he put in the work, he would be successful. And looking out from his balcony inside of his upscale neighborhood, Eric felt like he was definitely on the right path. Selling luxury cars had really paid off. He made great money, and he had no intention of slowing down. Just then, Eric heard a knock at his door. He turned around and walked through his apartment and put his glass down on the coffee table, then opened up the front door and saw a 34-year-old Katrina Benz standing there. Katrina smiled, got up on her toes, and threw her arms around Eric's neck and gave Eric a big kiss. Then they both went inside, and Katrina curled up on the brown leather couch in front of the TV, and Eric went to the kitchen to pour Katrina a glass of wine, and then he joined her on the couch. Eric and Katrina had been seeing each other for a few months, but they were still keeping things really casual. They had met outside of the apartment building and discovered right away they had a lot in common. Katrina shared Eric's really strong work ethic, and it's what allowed her to become a nurse. They also both loved basketball, and so their relationship consisted of basically hanging out a couple of times a week, watching a basketball game together, and then spending the night together. And that night in particular, they were both really excited because there was this big NBA playoff game on. And so, sitting on the couch, Eric and Katrina talked about who they thought was going to win the game, and then they also talked about how their jobs were going. But Eric looked a bit distracted. He kept picking up his phone and checking the time. Finally, he just turned and asked Katrina if she was up for going on a quick ride before the game started. Katrina figured he just wanted to go out and maybe pick up some food or something, but no, Eric told her he actually wanted to go meet a guy who he could buy marijuana from. He said the guy lived close and it wouldn't take very long. Katrina was surprised. She knew Eric occasionally smoked weed, but he'd never asked her to go buy weed with him. Still, she figured it wasn't that big of a deal. They were in a really nice suburb, so how dangerous could this weed dealer really be? So Katrina told him that was fine, as long as they got back in time for the start of the game. Eric promised they wouldn't miss a thing. Then he and Katrina left the apartment, went down the elevator, and out to Eric's car. After driving for a few minutes, Eric turned onto a side street in front of a small apartment complex, and he pulled over to the curb and put his car in park. To Katrina, the street seemed totally empty, but suddenly the back driver's side door opened, and this tall, skinny-looking drug dealer with a scraggly beard slid into the back seat. The dealer quickly handed a paper bag over the seat to Eric, and Eric took the bag, he looked inside, and he saw a Ziploc baggie of marijuana, and after he was satisfied, he handed the cash back to the dealer. The dealer then hopped out of the car without a word, closed the door, and disappeared back into the apartment complex. The entire exchange took less than a minute. Eric turned and smiled at Katrina, and then he turned the car back on, and he drove them back to his place just in time to watch the opening tip-off of the playoff game. And then later that night, after the game was over, Eric and Katrina went to bed together. Then, right before Katrina actually went to sleep, she reminded Eric that she had to work early the next day, so pretty likely when he woke up in the morning, she'd be gone. Eric said he totally remembered, then he kissed Katrina goodnight, and the couple rolled over and they both drifted off to sleep. And hours later, in the early morning of June 5th, 2012, Eric was still asleep in his bed when somebody walked into his bedroom, walked across the floor, and stood right beside him, staring down at him as he slept. The following day, so June 6th, Eric's manager at the luxury car dealership sat in his office trying to get a hold of Eric on the phone. Eric was supposed to work that day, but he hadn't shown up, and his phone kept going to voicemail. Top salespeople like Eric occasionally took what everybody at the dealership called unscheduled days off, but Eric always made sure to let his manager know if he wasn't going to come in, and he hadn't on this day. So the manager walked to the showroom floor and talked to a couple of other salespeople, but none of them had heard from Eric either. The manager started to get worried, so he went back to his office and he called Eric's emergency contact, who was one of his older sisters. The manager told Eric's sister he didn't want to upset her, but he hadn't seen or heard from Eric that day. Eric's sister was totally frightened by this, and she immediately called Eric, and when he didn't answer, she called her other sister and her other brother to see if they had heard from him. But they too had not talked to Eric in at least a couple of days. Eric's sister, the one who the car dealership manager had called, had a really uneasy feeling. Eric talked or texted with at least one of his siblings every single day, and so Eric's sister felt like, this was an actual emergency, and so she took a deep breath and dialed 911. After explaining what was going on with Eric, the 911 operator said that police would send officers by Eric's apartment to do a wellness check on him. Eric's sister thanked the dispatcher, and then she went right to her car and raced across town to Eric's apartment building. A little before 5 p.m., Eric's sister waited downstairs in the apartment complex lobby while a building manager led 2 police officers up to Eric's apartment on the 6th floor. One of the officers knocked on Eric's door but got no response, so the building manager unlocked the door and stepped back. At that point, the officers stepped forward, walked inside, and began calling out to see if anybody was home, but again, there was no answer. So the officers walked across the apartment, down a short hallway, and came to a closed bedroom door. One of the officers knocked, but there was still no answer, so they opened up the door and walked inside. And there was Eric laying in bed. There was a sheet that was pulled up all the way up to his mouth. The officers walked over, and they saw there was a single gunshot wound to Eric's head. Both officers thought it looked like Eric Samoa had taken his own life. The officers quickly went back downstairs, and when they got there, one of them placed his hand on Eric's sister's shoulder. He said he was so sorry, but they had found her brother deceased upstairs in his bed. Eric's sister let out a shriek that echoed off the lobby walls. She started wailing and crying. She could not believe her little brother was gone. About 45 minutes after Eric's body was discovered, Detective Dmitry Ruvin of the Montgomery County Police Department walked into the lobby of Eric's apartment building. He saw officers standing with 2 women and a man who were huddled together and crying. Ruvin was one of the youngest detectives on the force, but he did have experience, and other cops basically envied him for his seemingly boundless energy. He waved one of the officers over, and the officer told him the people in the lobby were Eric's siblings. Ruvin asked the officer to let them know that he would be down shortly to talk to them. Then Ruvin quickly walked across the lobby and took the elevator up to the 6th floor. Ruvin walked through Eric's apartment, and he understood why the first officers on the scene had thought Eric killed himself. The door to the apartment had been locked when they arrived, and there was no sign of forced entry, and expensive items like Eric's computer and TV had been left untouched, so this didn't look like a robbery gone wrong. Ruvin stepped into the bedroom, and he saw that Eric had a single bullet wound in his head, another sign of a possible suicide. But Ruvin searched the entire bedroom and didn't find a gun, so he knew the officers had been wrong. There was no way Eric had shot himself. Someone clearly had shot him. Ruvin looked down at Eric's body, and for whatever reason, he felt this instant connection with the guy. He couldn't really explain it. He'd worked a lot of homicide cases, and he always felt sympathy for the victims. But this was something different. This was more personal. Reuven told himself that the reason for this connection must just be because Eric looked to be about the same age as Reuven. It was like, here's this guy with every opportunity in front of him, and somebody took that away from him. And this just made Reuven really upset and angry. It just seems so wrong. Reuven took out his phone and called the station to let his boss know that this was a homicide, not a suicide, and so he would need an investigative team sent over. And not long after that call, forensics analysts arrived at Eric's apartment and began sweeping through it. And they would discover a single .380 caliber bullet casing in the bedroom, but there still was no sign of a gun anywhere. They also did a sweep of the apartment for fingerprints and possible DNA samples, but they knew that type of evidence might not get them very far in this case. The fact that there was no sign of forced entry or any kind of struggle meant there was a good chance Eric knew his killer. So the analysts figured they would just find lots of prints of friends or family who were often at Eric's place and so were not suspicious, and any of them could be guilty. And Reuven knew right now 3 of Eric's family members, his sisters and brother, were down in the lobby waiting to talk to him. So Reuven let the forensics team continue their work, and then he headed back downstairs. The elevator doors opened, and Reuven could hear Eric's siblings still crying in the lobby. Reuven walked slowly now, and he heard the sound of his shoes clicking on the concrete floor. He hated this part of the job. Eric's siblings only knew that their brother had been found dead in his apartment. They didn't know what happened. So Reuven lowered his head and approached them, and he told them he was so sorry, but their brother had actually been murdered. That sent Eric's brother and sisters into another fit of screaming. Detective Reuven stood with them and let them get as loud and as angry as they wanted. Then eventually, one of Eric's sisters caught her breath and wiped the tears from her eyes, and she looked right at Reuven, and she told him he needed to speak with a woman named Denise Harrington. Reuven asked who Denise was. Eric's sister said Denise was Eric's girlfriend, and she was no good. She was 20 years older than Eric, and his entire family knew Denise was just using Eric for his money. Reuven thanked Eric's siblings for their time, and he said police would follow up with them soon. Then he offered his condolences again and headed back upstairs. When he got there, he could tell, after hours and hours of searching this apartment, really the only thing investigators had found so far was just that bullet casing. But Reuven felt like this Denise person was a really strong lead, and so it didn't really matter right now that they didn't have much evidence. So Reuven found the phone number for Eric's girlfriend, Denise, gave her a call, and when she picked up, he told her he needed to meet with her to ask some questions about her boyfriend. The day after Eric's body was discovered, members of Reuven's team re-interviewed Eric's brother and sisters and looked into other family members who might have spent time at Eric's apartment. But Reuven himself remained focused on Eric's girlfriend, Denise. At the station, he led Denise into an interview room, sat across from her at a small wooden table, and handed her a bottle of water. He thanked Denise for coming in, and then asked her if she understood why she was there. And she just said, I understand there's some questions about Eric. Reuven nodded, and then asked her very gently if she knew that Eric had been killed. A look of total shock came across Denise's face, and she just began shaking her head, no, and then just said she couldn't believe it. People loved Eric. Reuven watched Denise very closely. She looked genuinely surprised and upset about this news, but he knew some people were naturally just very good actors. Looking at Denise now, it also struck Reuven how big the age gap was between her and Eric. Eric's family clearly had not approved of a woman 20 years older dating their little brother, but Reuven did not think being older than Eric somehow made Denise more suspicious. Reuven asked Denise if it was strange that she hadn't heard from her boyfriend in the last couple of days, before he was killed, but she told him it was not strange that she hadn't heard from Eric because Eric was actually not her boyfriend. Not anymore, anyways. Reuven was confused. Eric's siblings seemed very certain that Denise was seeing Eric and using Eric as far as they were concerned, but Denise explained that she and Eric had hit a rough patch about a month earlier. She found out he was obviously cheating on her when she noticed text messages coming into his phone from 2 other women. And so Denise just did not want to be treated that way, and so she had ended it with Eric, like their relationship was done and she had not talked to him in a while. And Denise said, if somebody close to Eric thought that she, Denise, and Eric were still together, it was probably only because Eric had not told anybody about the breakup. Denise felt like, Eric likely wanted his family to think he was settling down and not still going out and seeing a bunch of different women at the same time. Finally, Reuven asked Denise where she was on the night of the murder, and she said she'd been at home and said police could check her phone records that would prove she was telling the truth. Reuven thanked her for her cooperation and said he would be taking her phone now so they could download the information to help corroborate her alibi. And a little later that day, after police had finished downloading the information from her phone, Reuven gave the phone back and let Denise go. And while Reuven did think Denise was genuinely shocked when she heard the news about Eric, he couldn't help but think, Denise had a clear motive to want to harm Eric. Eric was cheating on her, and a jilted lover almost always had to be considered a viable suspect. But for now, Reuven would just have to wait until his team went through all of that information downloaded off Denise's phone to figure out if she really was a viable suspect. So in the meantime, Reuven headed back up to the 6th floor of Eric's apartment building to talk to some of Eric's neighbors. Reuven knocked on a door that was nearby Eric's apartment, and a guy in his 20s answered. The young man did not look surprised to see a detective standing there. He said he knew Eric pretty well, and he knew Eric had been killed. Then, without being prompted, he told Reuven the police should really question Eric's girlfriend. Reuven said he'd already met with Denise, but the young man just kind of stared at him, and then he said no, Eric's girlfriend's name was not Denise, it was Katrina. If you recall, Katrina was the woman who watched basketball with him on the night he was killed. The neighbor told Reuven that Katrina lived in the apartment building, and he had seen Eric with Katrina a bunch of times. Reuven thanked the young man for his help, and then the door shut, and then Reuven just stood there in the hall thinking. Denise had mentioned during her interview that 2 women had been texting Eric, which is how she had figured out he was cheating on her, but neither of those 2 women were named Katrina. And Eric's family had never mentioned anybody named Katrina at all. And so now, Reuven thought he might have a jilted lover in Denise and a secret lover in Katrina to consider as suspects. Reuven really wanted to make sure he was fully prepared before he brought in Katrina for an interview, so he and his team did some digging. They found out Katrina was from Mississippi, and she had come to Maryland a few months earlier to work as a nurse for the National Institutes of Health, a government organization focused on public health research. But much more important than that, at least to Detective Reuven, was that several people in the apartment building saw Eric and Katrina together on the night before Eric was killed. A couple of days after Eric was killed, Detective Reuven found himself back in an interview room talking to a woman he thought was Eric's girlfriend. And just like he had done with Denise, he started the interview by asking Katrina if she knew why she was there. And Katrina, who had a sort of confused look on her face, told him that, she understood she was here to help with some investigation, but she hadn't been given any more details than that. She figured it might have something to do with where she worked, but she didn't know. At this point, Reuven told her point blank that her boyfriend, Eric, had been found murdered in his apartment, and that she was the last person anybody had seen him with. Immediately, a look of complete disbelief came across her face, and as she pulled her legs up onto her seat and grabbed her knees with her arms and began rocking back and forth, she began saying to Reuven that, why would anybody want to do this? Everybody loves Eric. And then she asked Reuven, is it possible that this was not Eric? But Reuven said no, this was definitely Eric, and he is definitely deceased. At this, Katrina clutched her knees even tighter, and then she looked up at Reuven with a very sad look on her face, and she said, she just felt so guilty. For the past couple of days, she'd been furious at Eric because he had not been responding to any of her text messages. And so she thought he was just being a jerk for some reason, but now she knew why he wasn't responding. It was because he was dead. That realization was like too much for Katrina to handle, and for a minute, it seemed like she might have a total breakdown. But then she stopped rocking in her chair, and she put her feet on the floor, and she leaned forward. It was like something had just clicked in her mind. She told Reuven that something really strange had happened on that last night that she was with Eric. Reuven leaned in and asked Katrina to please walk him through everything she could remember about that night. Katrina took a deep breath, and then she began speaking. She said she and Eric had met up to watch basketball, but they left his apartment so Eric could go buy some weed. Then, after Eric got his weed, the couple went back to Eric's apartment, they watched the game, they had sex, and then they went to sleep. None of this seemed very out of the ordinary to Reuven, and he was about to say as much, but Katrina said, "Hold on, the weird part happened the next morning." She said the next morning when she woke up around 5 a.m., because she had to get up really early for work, she had looked over and Eric was not in the bed. Then she heard voices coming from some other room. She thought maybe Eric was on the phone, so she just got dressed, grabbed her things, and walked out of the bedroom, and the drug dealer who had sold Eric the marijuana the night before was standing right there. Katrina said this totally freaked her out. Doing, a quick weed deal in the car was one thing, but having a drug dealer in the apartment at 5 a.m. seemed wrong to her. And being a nurse for a government organization, she did not want to be associated with any drug dealers. But that wasn't all. Katrina said when she looked at this dealer, this tall, skinny guy with a scraggly beard, he seemed really agitated. And when Katrina told Eric she was leaving, the dealer turned and looked at her and walked over, grabbed her arm, and basically rushed her out of the apartment and then shut the door behind her. Reuven got Katrina to give him as many details as she could about the dealer and about the location where he had sold Eric marijuana the night before, and after taking all that down, Reuven stopped for a second because he thought of something. He asked Katrina, why didn't you check in on Eric later in the day or really at any point over the next couple of days when he wasn't responding to her text messages? Like the last thing you saw was Eric alone in his apartment with the sketchy drug dealer who rushes you out the door and shuts the door behind you. You said the drug dealer seemed agitated, so what? You just figured everything was fine and you just didn't think to follow up? Katrina could see how suspicious it seemed, but she explained to Reuven that her relationship with Eric was very casual. They basically were not a girlfriend and boyfriend, they were not a couple, they were just kind of hooking up periodically, and that was it. And so Katrina said, she just was worried that if she really aggressively followed up trying to get in touch with Eric and, went over to his place to check on him, that might come off to Eric like she was this really obsessed girlfriend, and she just didn't want that. And then over the course of a couple of days, when Eric did not get in touch with her, she got mad at him. Why is he not getting in touch with her? And so it just kind of led to this silence. Reuven nodded and then thanked Katrina for coming in and told her he would be in touch if he needed more information from her. Not long after Katrina left, Reuven's team worked to track down that drug dealer. And with Katrina's description of him and the exact location of where Eric purchased that marijuana from him, it didn't take them very long to find this guy. His name was William Woodfork, and he quickly became the focus of Reuven's investigation. A couple of days after the interview with Katrina, Reuven sat back down inside the interview room with William Woodfork. William was tall and lanky with a patchy beard, just like Katrina had described, and he was very, very nervous seeming. He was having a really hard time sitting still. Police had not told William why he was here, and so Reuven figured William was likely very worried about getting busted for dealing drugs. But Reuven acted like he didn't notice, and he just casually reached into a folder and pulled out a photo of Eric, and he placed it on the table in front of William, and he said to William, "This man right here in this photo is a guy named Eric, and he was just murdered." And then Reuven asked William, "How long have you known Eric?" William looked down at the photo, and after staring for a second, he just shook his head and said he'd never met the guy. Reuven smiled a very knowing smile and then told William it was not a good idea to be lying to the police. This is a homicide investigation. This is about as serious as it gets. Reuven told William he had Eric's phone records, so he knew William had texted Eric the night before Eric got murdered. Immediately, William hung his head and stared at the floor and then began backtracking. He admitted to Reuven that actually he had sold Eric weed a few times, including on that past Monday night. At this point, Reuven stopped smiling, and he immediately asked William, "Okay, fine, you sold him weed on Monday. Why did you go to Eric's apartment early on Tuesday morning at around 5 a.m.? William immediately looked up and told Reuven he was not some big-time drug dealer out settling scores. He's like, "I had nothing to do with Eric getting killed." But Reuven was not about to take the word of someone who had literally just lied to his face. And with the phone records and William admitting he saw Eric the night before the murder, Reuven felt like he had more than enough evidence to pursue this lead further. So not long after that meeting, Reuven secured a warrant to search William's apartment. And when they did search his apartment in the week following Eric's murder, police would find a .380 caliber handgun, the same type of handgun that had been used to kill Eric. And so Detective Reuven was pretty much positive he had just found Eric's killer. But later that week, when the ballistics report on Williams' gun came back, it showed the ammunition used in his gun did not match the bullet casing that was found in Eric's bedroom. meaning this gun was not the murder weapon. Reuven was not willing to totally eliminate William as a suspect. It just seemed too coincidental that this guy would happen to have a .380 caliber handgun in his apartment, but it could be just a bizarre coincidence. And without more compelling evidence, he knew any case brought against William would not hold up in court. And so suddenly, Reuven felt like this investigation had just stalled in a major way. Investigators went from believing they had their killer right back to having no idea who they were even looking for. And at the same time, Reuven began getting daily calls from Eric's sisters, but he had no new information to share with them. And Reuven told other investigators that he felt like he was letting Eric's family down. Weeks passed without any new leads coming in, and then several months went by, and pretty soon this case became much less of a priority for the department. But Reuven refused to let the case just go cold. In fact, he put a photo of Eric on his desk to remind him of the job he still needed to do. And he continued to talk to Eric's sisters almost every day, and he promised them as long as he was on the force, he would never stop looking for their brother's killer. In May of 2013, almost a year after Eric's murder, Detective Reuven continued his investigation. But almost no new evidence had surfaced, and so he was basically running out of ideas. Reuven pored over Eric's case files whenever he could, looking for anything that he might have just overlooked. And there was one piece of evidence, or really a missing piece of evidence, that had always bothered him. The gun that had been used to kill Eric had never been found. So now, Reuven decided to try something he knew was a total long shot, but he felt like he had nothing to lose. Police often confiscated guns as evidence in investigations, and they occasionally received guns that people had simply found and turned into them. So, Reuven reached out to every police department in the county and asked for a list of all the .380 caliber handguns they had received in the past year, either confiscated as evidence or turned into them by a Good Samaritan. The other departments all cooperated, and soon Reuven ended up with this list of 60 .380 caliber handguns. And then Reuven began the painstaking work of tracking down the history of each of those 60 guns. And the first 58 guns led him nowhere. But when he began looking into the 59th gun on the list, he thought he might have found something promising. That gun had been found discarded on the side of the road on the Capitol Beltway, one of the busiest streets in Washington, D.C. The man who had handed this gun over to police had been sitting in bumper-to-bumper traffic and just happened to look over and see the gun lying on the side of the road. And that spot on the Beltway was not very far from Eric's apartment. But there was another detail in this report about this 59th gun that gave Reuven the biggest jolt of energy he'd felt in almost a year. The man who found this gun had found it just 2 days after Eric's murder. Using the 59th gun's serial number, Detective Reuven tracked down the weapon's original owner, but that man told Reuven he'd actually sold the gun at a pawn shop years earlier, and so Reuven found that pawn shop and got their sales records for the gun, and from there, Reuven started tracking down every one of the gun's previous owners, and there were quite a few of them. And this process dragged on for weeks and weeks, but finally, right around the actual 1-year anniversary of Eric's death, Reuven talked to a man who had sold this 59th gun to a pawn shop just a few months before Eric was killed. And so Reuven felt like there was a legitimate chance that whoever had bought the gun from this latest pawn shop was the killer. Now, the pawn shop was nowhere near Reuven's police station, but he decided he would take a trip there, hoping all of his work would pay off. So, on a hot and humid June day, Detective Reuven, along with several other officers, walked into the pawn shop on the outskirts of a small rural town. Reuven thought it was the kind of place someone would never find unless they already knew it existed. The pawn shop owner greeted Reuven from behind the counter in a very thick southern drawl, and he asked how he could help. Reuven told the owner he was looking for sales records on a particular gun, and then he gave the owner the serial number of the gun. But the owner right away just sighed and said he was really sorry, but he couldn't do that. He'd stored those sales records in diaper boxes out in a shed behind the shop, and earlier that year, rats had gotten into the shed and started gnawing away at all the diaper boxes. The owner was worried he would lose the records to the rats, and he knew losing gun sale records could get him in big trouble with the federal government, so he handed over all those records inside of the chewed-up diaper boxes to the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, or the ATF. The ATF is a United States government agency that primarily monitors firearms trafficking. Reuven just stood there and stared at the pawn shop owner. He felt like laughing at how absurd this was. He never imagined diaper boxes and rats would play a role in his homicide investigation, but here he was. And so ultimately, Reuven thanked the owner and then left the pawn shop and headed back to Montgomery County, Maryland, to the police station. And once he got there, he called an ATF agent that he knew and told him what had happened. Reuven offered to go to ATF storage and personally dig through all the chewed-up diaper boxes himself, but the agent assured him the ATF would find whatever he needed. And on June 12, 2013, so over a year after Eric's murder, Reuven got a call at his desk from that ATF agent. And the agent told Reuven that they had just tracked down all those diaper boxes, and they had found the specific report Reuven was looking for, and so he was faxing the report over right now. Reuven thanked the agent and hung up the phone, but as soon as he did, he felt so nervous. It was like every muscle in his body was getting tense. He knew if this report that he was about to read didn't give him any new information, he would have no idea what to do next. And so as he was thinking about this, he looked over at the photo of Eric on his desk and just held his breath. The fax machine near his desk started printing out the report. Reuven got up, walked over to the machine, grabbed the report, and began to read through it. And as he did, Reuven felt like a huge weight had been lifted off his shoulders. After more than a year of investigating this case and weeks of tracking down gun owners all over the place, Reuven knew, based on this report, that he could call Eric's siblings right now and tell them he had found their brother's killer. Based on records from the ATF and evidence collected over the course of a year, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Eric Samoa in the early morning hours of June 5th, 2012. The killer was standing at the foot of Eric's bed, watching him sleep. They'd been standing there for a few minutes, just staring, but they knew now it was time to act. So they reached into their bag that was slung over their shoulder and pulled out a .380 caliber handgun. The killer then walked forward until they were right next to Eric, trying to be as quiet as possible. They didn't know what Eric would do if he suddenly woke up. And so at this point, the killer kind of leaned over Eric until they were so close to him, they could actually feel Eric's breath on their cheek. Then they slowly pulled up their gun and aimed it basically point blank at Eric's forehead, and then they fired. The bullet lodged inside of Eric's brain, and he died without ever waking up. The killer quickly tossed the gun into their bag and then pulled the bedsheet up to Eric's mouth to try to cover up some of the blood. Then the killer ran out of the bedroom, slamming the door shut behind them. They opened up the front door, they locked the doorknob, and then closed it, and then they ran down the hallway to the elevator. As the elevator was making its way down, the killer took several steadying breaths, doing their best to look as calm as possible. When the elevator doors opened, the killer walked across the lobby, went out to the parking lot, got in their car, and began driving towards Washington, D.C. Now, it was still dark out, and the killer saw headlights up ahead from a line of cars driving towards the city, and so since they didn't want to get caught in traffic, the killer just hit the gas and whipped down the road. The killer reached the Capitol Beltway in D.C. before traffic got too bad, and at this point, they rolled their window down, reached into their bag in the passenger seat, grabbed the murder weapon, and threw it out the window. The first chance they had, the killer turned around and sped back across the Maryland border. About 30 minutes after fleeing Eric's apartment, the killer walked back into Eric's apartment building, except this time, when they got in the elevator, they did not go up to the 6th floor. They went up to a lower floor. And then once they got to that floor, they got out of the elevator, walked down the hall, and went inside of their own apartment. And once they were inside, they showered, put on a nurse's uniform, and went right back downstairs to go to work. Katrina Ben, Eric's basketball-loving, casual romantic partner, was Eric's killer. It would turn out Katrina wanted a lot more out of her relationship with Eric. She did not like the idea of it being casual. And the week before the murder, Eric had blown off Katrina on a night they were supposed to hook up. Katrina knew Eric was out with actually another woman, and she told him she was not okay with that. But Eric was just not ready to be in a fully committed relationship with Katrina. In fact, he didn't even want his family to meet her. So Katrina started to feel like Eric was only using her for sex, and it made her really angry. So angry that she decided she would kill him. When Katrina first arrived at Eric's apartment to watch the basketball game, she had the gun with her, but she just wasn't sure if this night was going to be the night that she actually followed through. But Eric's impromptu drug deal gave Katrina potential cover. She could make up a story and say the dealer had shown up at Eric's apartment and seemed really suspicious, and basically make it seem like the drug dealer had killed Eric. However, the dealer, William Woodfork, had nothing to do with the murder. He had never even been to Eric's apartment. It took Detective Reuven tracking down the gun that was used to kill Eric and delving into the gun's history to finally discover Katrina was the killer, because he had traced the gun back to a pawn shop in a small rural town in Mississippi that just happened to be Katrina's hometown. Now, at this point, Reuven was very sure Katrina was the killer. However, he needed a receipt that showed she was the one who bought this gun last. But when he went to the pawn shop in Mississippi, those sales records were in that shed getting destroyed by rats, and so they had been shipped to the ATF. But Reuven was able to get those records from the ATF, and as soon as he looked through them, he saw right there Katrina's name was on the record. She had bought the murder weapon. She definitely was the killer. And so Katrina would be arrested at her parents' house in Mississippi, and she would be found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison, plus an additional 20 years with no chance for parole. To this day, Eric's family say it was Reuven's patience and determination that ultimately got justice for their little brother and gave the family some sense of closure.
We meet where daylight never goes. Behind the glass, the city close. Your ring still shines in silver light, but I'm the warmth you hold tonight. The clock keeps breathing, soft and loud. We steal the silence from the crowd. Borrowed hours.
Thank you for listening to the MrBallen's podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious content,